we have another outrageously beautiful fall in New England, and Thanksgiving is upon us. What's not to be grateful for? With that in mind, I got in my truck last Saturday and I drove from my suburban home outside of Boston down to Cape Cod and Plymouth to celebrate and observe some of the places of the first Thanksgiving, which took place now 400 years ago. My name is James McQuivey, and I welcome you to this short video of reflections on the places and the graces of the first Thanksgiving. In the cold November of 1620, 401 years ago, the first English settlers, pilgrims we call them today, reached the shores of what is now the state of Massachusetts. The inspired and inspiring story of those pilgrims has much to teach us. As we pause to consider our Thanksgiving celebration this year, we're going to take a moment to see what we can learn from the first colonists who suffered, strived, and ultimately thrived 4 centuries ago. Now, I happen to be here in Plymouth, just a stone's throw away from the location where the original first Thanksgiving would have taken place. The first place, though, that we want to describe in our journey today is not here where it all ended. We're going to start with the mighty Mayflower. This ship, the Mayflower II, is a recreation of the original ship, faithfully rebuilt to the original specs of the ship that brought 102 colonists and 30 crewmen across the Atlantic. This place is where the pilgrims lived for more than 2 months as they worked their way through devastating storms, crippling seasickness, and the loss of a crew member. Why they were on this ship and what they hoped to accomplish through so much misery is a story that goes back more than 100 years. It's a story you know because it starts with Christopher Columbus's journey in 1492, more than a century before. But it's also a story you might not know. The story of a jealous English nation that watched Spain dominate exploration of the New World for decades before the upstart Queen Elizabeth started sending her explorers, pirates really, to raid Spanish settlements and try to discover new lands and resources for Her Majesty's rapidly expanding kingdom. By the year 1603, when Queen Elizabeth died, having built her Protestant kingdom into a global empire, the English still hadn't established colonies in the New World that would firmly plant English aspirations in American soil. The task was left to Queen Elizabeth's successor, King James, the same King James of the Bible fame. It was his responsibility to now plant English feet on American soil for colonization, which he began first in 1607 with the establishment of the Jamestown colony, appropriately named, in what is now Virginia. The British were further looking for men, women, and children who would be willing to leave the relative comfort and wealth of England behind to start a new life. But really, who would be willing to do that? Well, the answer was found among a group of English subjects who had already left England, secretly emigrating from the country without permission, an act that was illegal in its day, and locating themselves in Holland, a short sail across the English Channel. Who were these people? They were Puritans, also called separatists, people who were separating from the Church of England. Puritans because they wanted to purify the Christian church from the influences of Catholicism. These Puritans had been fined and arrested for not supporting the Church of England and had absconded away to Holland to practice their faith in freedom. But once in Holland, they began to see the prosperity of Dutch life created its own difficulties. Their children were learning Dutch and were developing refined Dutch tastes. Puritans, preferring to live lives of self-denial and sacrifice, worried that their newly purified faith would become corrupted. It was in this circumstance that investors in London secured a patent, a legal right to settle a portion of land at the mouth of the Hudson River in present-day New York. These investors got in touch with the Puritans of Holland and made them an offer. Go to the New England, settle the lands there, and produce goods that could be shipped back to the mother country. The Puritans would be granted the right to live their own religion and would no longer be fugitives in their home country. Unsurprisingly, hundreds of Dutch Puritans and hundreds of their friends still back in England, they signed up, many of them selling all their possessions to join the journey that was in the making. The plan was for 2 ships, the Speedwell and the Mayflower, to take a large assembly of Puritans from Holland, meeting up the coast of England to take on additional passengers, and then across the Atlantic to the Hudson River Valley, planning to arrive in the summer of 1620, with plenty of time to clear land, build homes, and plant crops. But the details didn't work out as planned. Some of the investors were dishonest. The captain of the Speedwell sabotaged his own ship so he could back out of the arrangement. And it wasn't until the 16th of September that the Mayflower left Plymouth, England, with 102 passengers and 30 crew. I'm going to insert some terminology here. Throughout the video, I'll refer to the Pilgrims as Pilgrims, Puritans, Separatists. I'll also refer to them as saints, because this was one of the words they used to describe themselves. Unlike their Catholic predecessors, they believed that everyone who was a believer and follower of Jesus Christ was sanctified or made a saint through him. So I'll refer to them in that terminology, but they also use the term strangers to describe people who were not saints. Strangers coming from the word Gentile. The Mayflower took 66 days to cross the Atlantic. They were together in the ship's middeck, a space about 75 feet long and 20 feet wide, for more than 2 months. They experienced devastating storms, at times having to drift rather than sail, to keep the sails from being torn by the storms. Because of this, along the way, one of the crew was swept overboard. One saint, Elizabeth Hopkins, gave birth to a son whom she appropriately named Oceanus. Their captain aimed them for the Hudson River, but being off by a few degrees, they first spotted land on November 9th, 1602, sighting Cape Cod for the first time. An early winter was already underway, and they had left late. The cold and the storms had taken their toll. Eager to try to make it to the favorable lands of the Hudson River, they did not touch land in Cape Cod, but instead attempted to navigate the shoreline along the south of the Cape. But as any captain will tell you, better be in the open sea than to navigate a shoreline without reliable charts. And between the risky waters and the strong headwind, the captain decided to turn back to see if there was suitable land back on Cape Cod. Though the Mayflower would remain their home for another month of exploring the sea, let's now pause to consider the grace of this place. The word grace refers to an act of goodwill. The Pilgrims experienced many of the graces of God throughout their entire journey and their settlement experience. Let's pause to consider the grace of the Mayflower. This sturdy ship was small and not ideal for sailing the open sea, but it was exactly what the saints needed to make it to the exact destination they didn't even know they were headed for. They only had the Mayflower, and it could only get them so far, precisely far enough to found this new colony. How are we like these pilgrims? God has plans and designs for each of us. But that doesn't mean that he'll provide you a yacht to carry out his work. We might get a small, slow Mayflower. It may even be its own source of challenge from time to time. And what's more, it might not even make it all the way to where we think our destination should be. We may stop short, thinking we have failed, only to later realize that the Lord had different plans all along. And this is one of his many graces. He will get us where he needs us to go. All we have to do is trust him and sail on. Now let's turn to the second place of our story. Cape Cod is deceptive in the distance, first of all, that it covers. Not only does it extend 65 miles east out into the ocean beyond the rest of Massachusetts, at the very end, it curls upward. And then at the very tip of that, it curls even more into this, which is the harbor of Provincetown. It wasn't called that, of course, in 1620 when the Pilgrims first came. Shortly after they put down anchor in the waters outside of Provincetown, Susanna White gave birth to the second baby of the Mayflower. This one really the first new citizen of this new colony. Now, she named that first baby Peregrine, which comes from the Latin root word for pilgrim. And this, interestingly enough, is where one of the ways that we begin to call these people pilgrims in history. It is not a word that they used to refer to themselves. They were Puritans and separatists, But instead, Peregrine became the example child who would go on to live a long and prosperous life of the kind of mentality born from suffering and hardship and yet able to grow in this new world, in this new colony. Here, this monument marks the spot where the eventual landing party first touched foot on American soil. We don't know exactly that it was here, but maps that were drawn at the time suggest that it was somewhere near here, and so commemorated to this day. Before they could set foot on land, however, they realized that they had a minor technical issue to attend to. You see, the Saints knew that they were about to settle in land they did not have legal title to. Their patent permitted them to set up a plantation in the Hudson River, but of course the winter was closing in, they were out of food, and so many of them were sick that they had no choice but to attempt to settle here, somewhere in this area. Recognizing that they had no legal form of government to structure their settlement, they agreed to create a new form. They drafted something called the Mayflower Compact. The Mayflower Compact represented a covenant to abide by a written constitution organized in a radically new form of government, self-government, with majority rule overseen through votes by elected governors. This dramatic departure from the structure of governments organized by the king and designed to accomplish royal purposes is why some historians refer to the Mayflower Compact as the predecessor to the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution of the United States, certainly. Here in Provincetown, they commemorate the signing of the Mayflower Compact with this wonderful monument. Adjacent to the monument is this plaque that reproduces the full text of the Mayflower Compact, beginning with the words, "In the name of God, amen," and then following through the entire agreement to live by the laws and ordinances that they would decide later to enact, a written constitution signed by these 41 men. The original document of the Mayflower Compact is lost to history, but several of the participants wrote their own versions and recorded them in their journals, and we have those to this day. And so here it is that at Provincetown, we take a moment to consider the second place and the associated grace. Sometimes it's our shortcomings that open the door to our greatest achievements. When we respond faithfully, trusting in God, and try to persist in doing the thing that God wants, we find new things worth doing, new places to come to, and new blessings to prepare to receive there. That's what these pilgrims had to do. Craft a new approach to how they were going to live their life in a new and unexpected place. It wasn't what you thought you were here to do. It wasn't the shore that you aimed for, but it's the shore that you landed on, and God blessed you for it. We're now ready to arrive at the third place of the first Thanksgiving. Beginning that early November, the Saints would spend the next month and a half exploring Cape Cod. Most of them staying on the ship most of the time, given how hard it was to bring the ship all the way in to the very shallow shores of the Cape. Instead, they would have 10 to 20 people disembark on a smaller ship that they had brought along. And those exploring parties would go armed with muskets in case they encountered local natives. It was in this exploration that they encountered a large hill that featured relatively cleared land. And taking this for a sign of possible settlement, a group of explorers went ashore and investigated this hill. This is the hill where in late November of 1620, this small party of explorers discovered a burial site and some abandoned homes. They also discovered a cache of dried corn with dozens of bushels of corn buried in the sand. The saints took this as a sign from God that he was watching out for them and providing for them. They took as much of the corn as they could carry, planning to eat some of it, but mostly plant it in the spring. I'm here at the base of what is now called Corn Hill, where a plaque commemorates the 16 pilgrims led by Miles Standish, William Bradford, Stephen Hopkins, and Edward Tilley, who found what they call here the precious Indian corn, and thereby called the hill Corn Hill. This was on November 16th now, so they'd been in the area where they'd previously landed in Provincetown on the 9th, just a week before. This is where the story gets a little complicated. They believed that the grounds were abandoned because they saw almost no signs of life. The truth is, there was a tribe of probably 500 natives from the Nauset tribe that lived in the area, in fact, very close nearby. But the tribe had made the decision to hide from the Englishmen. This is for two reasons. First, an English trader had sailed through the area a few years before and had captured several of the natives, killing some of them, including members of the Nauset tribe, and taking others away to European slavery. This all made the natives naturally very skittish about interacting with more English sailors. And secondly, recent contact with other European ships had spread diseases, probably the plague, perhaps smallpox. These are common infections in Europe at the time, but unheard of in the Americas. These diseases had ravaged the natives, who lacked any natural resistance to them at all, in some areas wiping out entire villages, reducing most tribes in the area by at least half in just a few short years, shortly before the Mayflower saints arrived. Now the saints knew none of this. All they saw was empty land, some of it with abandoned homes waiting to be explored and used. They thought the corn was similarly free for the taking. Which leads us to the next grace of the first Thanksgiving. This one is trickier to see, but it's ultimately as powerful as the others. You see, the Nauset had stored their corn there for their own use, watching as the Englishmen took it away. They were rightly upset. Now you might say, but didn't God give the corn to the pilgrims? Even the pilgrims later came to realize that this was wrong. Later, after they had settled in Plymouth, the next and final place and the actual location of the first Thanksgiving, they became acquainted with the Nauset, who accused them of taking their store of corn and demanded reparation. Wisely, the leaders of the colony admitted it was wrong, apologized, and gave gifts of food and knives and other resources to express their goodwill. Now let's take a lesson from this. Even when we know that God commands us to do something, along the way we can still sometimes make mistakes. But the twin grace of this example is that God gives us our agency, his first and great grace. In his great plan, it is his desire that we learn to do what is right because we desire it. Thus, we have the option to choose otherwise. And that's where his greatest grace of all becomes manifest. God gives us the atonement of Jesus Christ, the path through which we can repent, seek forgiveness, and return to his good graces. This is what the pilgrims eventually did once they understood the harm that they had created. So let us move to our fourth and final place of the first Thanksgiving, Plymouth Harbor. Barely a harbor by any definition of the word. Plymouth Harbor stands at the mouth of a relatively small tributary, a creek, really. Here had been an entire village of Wampanoag natives called Patuxet. This is one of the villages hardest hit by the Great Plague of the 1610s, and it's estimated that as many as 90% of the locals had died, forcing survivors to join neighboring Wampanoag villages. When the pilgrims landed, they found cleared lands ready for them to take up residence. It was finally on December 21st, 1620, that the saints and strangers landed in Plymouth Bay, out there. They mapped out the shore and along the town brook and decided on a place to begin building their homes. Winter was in full swing now. Many of the passengers were too sick to leave the ship. Those with strength began building the colony. The first common house was nearly completed in January, built for general use and for use as a hospital, right here where this house stands behind me today. None of the original first 7 houses of the colony still stand, but each is marked with a place marker. Interestingly, each single man was ordered to join himself to one of the 19 families in order to eliminate the need to build more homes than absolutely necessary in that first difficult winter. Each extended family group was assigned a plot, and they each built their own homes, and settlement was mostly built by February, reaching up this street, today called Leyden Street, but originally called First Street, because it was literally the first street in Massachusetts. The hospital was in constant use those first months. There were times when as few as half a dozen people were strong enough to take care of the others and continue building up the homes. 31 of the company were dead by the end of February, with deaths still rising. By the end of winter, when April had finally come, only 47 of 102 original colonists had survived. In this time, half the Mayflower crew also died. It was in this bleak period that in March of 1621, a member of the Wampanoag named Samoset entered the grounds of the Plymouth colony and introduced himself with these now famous words: "Welcome, Englishmen." He was completely naked, though the water of the town brook was still frozen over. He had learned rudimentary English by trading with the sailing ships that occasionally came through, trading for furs and native plants. Samoset explained that he came from what is today Maine, and that the head sachem, or chief of the Wampanoag, was interested in their intentions and wanted to know whether they could coexist in peace. It was Samoset who introduced them to another Wampanoag native named Tisquantum, sometimes called Squanto. Squanto spoke nearly perfect English. Years before, he had been captured by slave traders and carried to Spain, where he was bought and sold enough times that he eventually ended up in England. His knowledge of the lands of America made him an obvious fit for voyages that were headed to America, and he was eventually able to join a ship's crew that returned him to his homeland, where he discovered empty villages where there had once been thousands of his fellow tribesmen. Samoset and Squanto arranged for the head chief of the Wampanoag, a warrior named Massasoit, to come visit the settlement, where he was received with respect, and the parties agreed to exist in peace next to each other. Squanto, seeing that his friendship with the English might be an advantage to him, became a regular visitor to the Plymouth colony. He concerned himself for their welfare, teaching them how to plant the corn seed they had taken, as well as how to fish and hunt for local food sources, including eels, which were a favorite of his and soon theirs as well. The Plymouth colony's relationship with Massasoit and the Wampanoag proved to be yet another blessing, as the other tribes in the area began to investigate the newcomers, who appeared to want to stay with their women and children, unlike all the other Europeans they had ever met. The Nausetts of Cape Cod and the Narragansetts, the largest tribe in the region, and a longtime rival of the Wampanoags, both posed potential threats to the colonists, but were persuaded to stay neutral after seeing the Plymouth colonists' relationship with the Wampanoags and their warrior leader, Massasoit. By the summer, the Mayflower and her crew had already returned to England, taking half the time to follow the Gulf Stream and its currents back home than it took to come west to Massachusetts. This left just 53 colonists, including the surviving babies. As the summer of 1621 passed and the harvest of beans, corn, and squash was significant, the Saints decided to celebrate with a 3-day festival of prayer and thanksgiving. Now, the term Thanksgiving, as it was used by the Puritans, referred to a period of serious prayer and contemplation. It did not involve a special feast, but their optimism after having survived their first horrible winter and the loss of so many family and friends caused them to also decide to have a traditional English harvest feast, the kind that were common in their homeland. Seeing that there was an abundance of ducks and geese and other fowl, Governor William Bradford sent 4 men from the community to go fowling or hunting for birds. They brought enough game that they were able to feast as a town or as a community for a whole week. And in this time of relative ease, they celebrated by shooting their muskets in the air, drawing many of their Wampanoag friends from the surrounding area. Soon, Sachem Massasoit also arrived, bringing 90 of his men to join in the festivities. Seeing that feasting was going on, the Wampanoag went out and killed 5 deer, bringing them back to be cooked on the bonfires in the village, where together they shared the bounty of the earth. Today, Leyden Street leads right into what used to be Town Square, where this feast likely took place. There would have been bonfires all up and down the road where all of the game and the birds would have been cooked. There wouldn't have been long tables, no linen tablecloths. There wouldn't even have probably been place settings. What meager furniture the colonists had, they would have dragged out and sat on, but mostly people would have stood or squatted on the ground as they waited for the meat to cook on the bonfires that were here in the middle of the common area. That's how the first Thanksgiving was experienced. It also wouldn't have happened in November. It was probably the last week of September, which would have made all of the trees here brighter and beautiful in a way that only a fall New England can be. It truly would have been one of the most joyous celebrations that these people had ever experienced in their lives, or would yet again for some time. A time of relative peace and bounty. Edward Winslow, a prominent citizen at the time, wrote about it in his journal this way. He said, "And although it be not always so plentiful as it was at this time with us, yet by the goodness of God, we are so far from want that we often wish you partakers of our plenty." Which leads us to the final grace of this last place of the first Thanksgiving. The grace is similar to what we celebrate around family tables each November. The grace of shared bounty among family and friends, gratitude for what God has given us, and a recognition that we still have a long road ahead of us, as the Pilgrims surely did, carving out a new life among the difficult wilderness and ever-changing tribal relations. And that on that road, we trust that God will point us toward that which is right, and we will try to do it. I find it fitting that this first Thanksgiving, which took place 400 years ago, was echoed very powerfully when, in 1863, at the closing of the Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln would declare the first official national day of Thanksgiving, using language that the Pilgrim saints would surely have understood and appreciated. On October 3rd, 1863, Lincoln wrote, "I do therefore invite my fellow citizens in every part of the United States to set apart and observe the last Thursday of November next as a day of thanksgiving. And I recommend to them that while offering up the ascriptions justly due to him, that they do also, with humble penitence for our national perverseness and disobedience, fervently implore the interposition of the Almighty hand to heal the wounds of the nation and to restore it as soon as may be consistent with divine purposes to the full enjoyment of peace, harmony, tranquility, and union." Really, each Thanksgiving is for us also an opportunity to come together in peace, harmony, and tranquility. As Lincoln so powerfully wrote, these are divine purposes, and we can only accomplish them with divine grace. This nation started from small seeds, including a few dozen pilgrims, and grew to become thousands, then millions, welcoming people from every continent and clime, until now we are more than 330 million strong. To this day, a people governed by written documents, covenanted together under the watchful eye of God, people who make mistakes, but know how, and thanks to whom they can repent. Truly, from small and simple things, a great thing has come to pass.